Hi, everyone. Welcome to our virtual event. I have just opened the webinar and I am seeing our lovely attendees trickling in. Thank you so much for being here. If you want to drop a line in the chat, we'd love to hear where you're joining us from, and I will get started in just a moment with an introduction and some housekeeping. So we are so glad you're here. Thank you everyone for joining us for this talk with Leonard Mlodinow tonight. It's going to be great. My name is Carell Centers, and I'm the events director here at Bookshop Santa Cruz, where I'm broadcasting live. And tonight we are thrilled to celebrate the release of Emotional: How Feelings Shape Our Thinking. So Leonard and I will have a conversation about the book, and then he'll answer some audience questions. And I'm just going to give you a couple of housekeeping details before we get started. We are in a Zoom webinar, so we cannot see or hear you at home. But we are here together. And again, like I said, I welcome you to drop a line in the chat if you feel inclined to connect and create a little sense of community here. Just make sure your messages are being sent to everyone if you want everyone to see them. And if you aren't into the chat, you find it distracting, just don't even worry about it. Let it go on without you. The closed captioning is also available. It's automatically on. You can hide it if you like. And this event, like I mentioned, it's going to be recorded so that you can rewatch it if you miss anything. We'll send that link out tomorrow evening, or you can find the replay on our YouTube page later tonight, and I'll put some links in the chat. That audience Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen is where you will pop in any questions for Leonard. We'll be getting to those a little bit later in the evening, so please drop those in as they come to you. We love to get to audience questions. Super interesting part of the night. Of course, I encourage you to buy the book from Bookshop Santa Cruz. This book is so great. It was just out on Tuesday. It has been so absorbing. I cannot put it down. Great stories in there, great science. And your purchase also supports local jobs and independent culture and shows the publisher that our audience is invested and engaged here in Santa Cruz. So thank you so much for your purchase. We do have some more events coming at you, all virtual at this point with a little bit of pencil for in-person. So stay tuned for that. I will put links again in the chat to sign up for our emails and to check out our events online. But now on to the main attraction. Leonard Mlodinow received his PhD in theoretical physics from the University of California, Berkeley, was an Alexander von Humboldt Fellow at the Max Planck Institute, and was on the faculty of the California Institute of Technology. His previous books span multiple sections in our store and multiple subsections within those genres. They include the bestseller, The Grand Design and a Briefer History of Time, both with Stephen Hawking, Subliminal, The Drunkard's Walk, and Elastic, among others. And we are so grateful to have Leonard Mlodinow here with us tonight. Welcome to the screen, Leonard.
Hey, Carell, good to be here.
So happy that you're here virtually. Actually, I meant to ask where you're joining us from tonight.
I'm in LA.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, so same time
Sunny
zone.
and warm. Well, not today, but.
Awesome. Well, I'd love to just kind of dive in. We have some really interesting things to talk about. This book is about the recent revolution in our understanding of human feelings. So I'd love it if we can just kind of start with like a definition of emotions. What are they? What counts as an emotion to a scientist?
Well, that's a great question, and not as easy to answer as it seems. You think that the first thing that you do is have a definition, but actually scientists who study emotion tend to use different definitions, and everyone seems to have their own particular way of looking at it. But the one that I like the best, that I, as a hard scientist, as a physicist, that I find the most precise, and I think the one that made the most sense to me, is the definition of emotion as a functional state of the mind. So that takes a little unpacking. I hope you have a little patience for that. You asked the question.
Please,
so.
I did ask the question, and I'm gonna ready myself for the words to come. Yes, please.
Okay, so your brain is an information processor. It's not like a computer. It's very different from a computer, but it does do that. It takes in data and computes the answers to questions. The question might be, what should I do next? Or what's my decision? Or how do I think about this? And the data isn't just, part of it is sensory data that comes in, and that comes in on an unconscious level. The data that comes into your eyes and your ears, If you read Subliminal, you learn how that works. But your conscious mind can't process all the data. It's too much of it as it comes in. So it gets processed through several layers of unconscious processing in your brain, and some of it gets presented to your consciousness. So that's some of the data that comes in. But there's also data about the context of the situation that you're in. There's your memories of the past, maybe similar situations, your current goals, your beliefs. And before your rational part of your brain can process that and answer whatever the question is, all these things have to be set up for it. And each element of that has to be, first of all, selected, because there's much more than you can consider. It has to be given weight. There's maybe skepticism applied to it. How much do you believe it? And so there's a lot involved in that selection before your strict logical processing happens. And all of that other stuff is highly dependent on your emotional state. Each emotion state has a different effect on which what you're paying attention to in your sensory input, which memories you have, what facts or data that you remember that you might believe, what your goals are, how important your goals are. Mm-hmm. All that is very highly affected by your emotion state. So an emotion is really a state of your brain that's a characteristic state depending on the emotion that affects your processing in that way. And I think it's good to give an example, because that was
please.
I'll give you an example from the real world, and then I'll give you a study. So the nice thing about the real world is it's real, but it's the nice thing about a laboratory study is that's a controlled environment and it's very precise. So it's good to do a little bit of each.
Perfect.
So I'll just pick a pretty mundane example. Carell, you're in Portland, right?
Santa Cruz, close.
I'm sorry, you're in Santa Cruz. I'm in Santa Cruz today. I made that mistake.
Where are we? Who knows?
I made that mistake once when I was actually live. So you'd be surprised to get on these book tours.
See, now you have an excuse during this, because we could be anywhere. But
yeah, but we know we were talking about my last time up in Santa Cruz, so that was just a little short circuit. But you're in Santa Cruz, but if you were here in LA, that's where I'm getting at. And let's say I'm going to meet you for a drink or for dinner, and I'm in downtown LA and I'm walking to meet with you, and I'm thinking, oh, I'm hungry. But maybe I'm thinking about what I want to order, so when I get there, I don't waste time staring at the menu and picking something. Sometimes I do that, or I'm trying to calculate how should I walk, what will get me there the fastest, is there a shortcut or whatever. And then I hear like a rustling in the bushes somewhere, and I'm in a dark street, and I know that downtown LA can be, parts of it have a lot of crime. Maybe that comes to mind. So I started out in a hunger state or more neutral state, and now I'm in a fear state. So what happens now? When you're fear state, first of all, sounds that would not have gotten your attention are suddenly very amplified. Your hearing actually gets better. Suddenly, like this rustling sound or whatever it was, all these little sounds of the city that I would have gone right over my head as I'm thinking about other things are now highlighted. Suddenly, I don't feel the hunger. I don't care about the food anymore. When I'm plotting my way, I'm not even thinking about what's the fastest. I'm thinking about what's the safest. So all these, your goals change, your sensory input changes, or at least what registers with you, that changes. The memories that I might think about along the way to answer whatever questions I'm answering, they all change. That's a much different state. And all my processing, if I'm asked the same question with the same facts in the same situation, I get a different answer if I'm a fear state versus a hunger state or a.
But so that's emotion. That's not logic. Like it would be, you would know that it's emotion that's giving rise to more caution. Like not like logic where, oh, the logical mind, like it's dark, crime stats, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Like, how do you know that that's emotions that are present?
Well, that how do I know that when it's fear that it's fear? I mean, I think most people recognize.
Okay. Yeah.
But that's another point that we'll get to. And in the laboratory, you don't just take their word for it, you confirm it. And the way that you do that is we can talk, there's a lot to talk about. We'll talk about that later. There are these inventory / questionnaires that I have, a lot of them in the book that you can take to measure to measure your emotion state or your propensity to one. So there's different ways of doing that, but that's how your thinking changes. But let me give you the lab illustration. There's a great experiment with disgust. And I like this experiment because it failed the first time they did it. So the subjects were college students, and the professor wanted to put them in a state of disgust and then wanted to test their thinking. And so he arranged to have them come into a filthy room with old pizza laying around, half drinking Coke, spills that dried up on the floor, and all kinds of rags, maybe some old towels laying around and stuff like that. And the experiment totally failed because when he measured their disgust level, they weren't disgusted. Because
this is my dorm. What am I looking at?
A typical dorm room or a fraternity house. So he redid the experiment and used fart spray, and that one worked. He didn't spray it; they faked the farts.
Yeah.
So these students who are in disgust state, he's comparing them to students in a controlled state. And so I've said that the state of emotion is an emotion is a state of your mental processing. So this is one thing that one characteristic of the disgust state is a propensity to dispel and get rid of things. That's, it's obvious that disgust makes you want to maybe spit out what's in your mouth, but scientists have found that more generally, it has a broader effect on your thinking too, and it tends to make you want to get rid of things. So the experiment was, while they're there and they're in this disgust, they do some phony something that's ostensibly is the experiment, but it's just there so that they don't guess what the experiment is. And when it's over, the researchers asked to buy back from them a pen that they had given them at the beginning, or another version of the experiment, just a gift box that they had given them. And the idea is that the people in the disgust state and the control state, they're processing the same data. Oh, this is what the brand of the pen, this is how it looks, feels, whatever they're processing to estimate its value. That the result of that processing would be different for the disgust versus the control group. And it was indeed the control group asked on average for about $4.50 for their pen, whereas the disgust group asked about $2.50. So there was a big difference in their calculation. You can imagine that you're disgusted now, and you're looking for a hotel room for your vacation. In a disgust state, you're going to have different decisions than if you're not. So that's a laboratory example of really the same thing that I talked about in the walking down the dark alley in fear. And so you asked about what another way of asking your question was what counts as an emotion. So I gave you a definition of an emotion, but in terms of which are the categories we talk about, that's also interesting.
Right. Yes. And in terms of the revolution that that this book is about, is like the changing science of how we understand emotions, and how, there were the 5 kind of like primary states that they used to think. And you talk about how it's actually, you can have emotions that can't be identified as just fear or just anxiety. Like that can be within itself, that can be a mixture. So it's really fascinating, the kind of expansion of our understanding of emotions themselves.
Right. So we all have a much greater, most of us, emotional intelligence than people many years ago. And one of the elements of understanding emotion that's changed a lot is that people used to feel just 20, 30 years ago, in not just in the popular culture, but in science, that emotions were counterproductive.
Yes.
That idea really goes back to Plato and the Christian philosophers who followed Plato. And the idea was that you have your rational mind where you do good things and make great decisions, and you have your emotional you that causes you to do things that you're embarrassed about later, or that.
You talk about Plato's, sorry to jump in, but you talk about Plato's chariot and the 2 horses and the kind of the clean, good one, and then the dark, bad one, which is kind of racist or something too, in a way. But, you have these kind of like 2 things that you need to control, and one is superior than the other. And I feel like those remnants of functioning that way as a society, especially like with gender stuff, like this idea that men don't feel emotions, or that men aren't allowed to express emotions, and how kind of damaging that can be for us as a society.
Right. Well, we can talk about that later too.
I'm sorry.
That's ahead of us too. Suppressing emotions being bad. Let's get back to that. But
let's put a pin in that one.
Right. So what we now know is that emotions are not counterproductive. They're essential to good decision making, and they're even more than essential. They cannot be separated. Your so-called rational processing always goes hand in hand with the emotional processing that is involved in the way I described it. And now I want to make it clear, I'm not saying that there's this part of your brain that's the rational brain and this part that's the emotional brain.
Right.
When I say rational part of your brain or rational thinking, I mean it more metaphorically or descriptively. Your brain executes rational or let's say logical processing using the usual rules of logic. You know, if A implies B and B implies C, then A implies C. So that's built in. But as it's processing in that way, the emotions are entering in as I described. So it all kind of always works together. And it's important to realize, just like in the discussed pen example, in your own decision-making, your financial or personal or workplace decision-making, what emotion state you might be in when you're making a decision or other people might be in when they're making a decision, and take that into account. You may change your decision later. You may decide to work on your emotion before you make your decision. You may understand better why someone behaved or acted or decided the way that they did when you understand that better. But when we were starting to talk about the emotions. So Darwin was really the first scientist to do first major scientist to do a major study of emotion, and he did that. I think in the 1860s or 70s. He published a book on it, and his goal was to understand how emotions fit into his theory of evolution, and he studied animals and he studied other cultures and concluded that there were 6 basic emotions: fear, anger, sadness, happiness, surprise, and disgust. They were all, each emotion was a definite, indivisible kind of thing. There's only one kind of fear, and each was separate. Fear is different from disgust, and he talked about the nerves that are involved, and later that became the brain. People start talking about centers of emotion for this and for that. You might remember that people used to call the amygdala the fear organ in the brain, and so forth. Well, it turned, and he also thought that emotions were counterproductive, and we had outgrown them, that they served a role in animals which don't have language and don't have the logical, rational, higher thinking that we do. So they had to live by their emotions. They had to communicate through their emotions. And that, for us, that's just a vestige. Well, and all that stuff that I just said is wrong. And that's what people have been discovering and investigating for about the last 10 or 20 years. It's just a huge explosion in this field. And so we now consider many, many more than those basic emotions. Some people still refer to those as basic emotions, but we don't make that dividing line that they're so much elevated over others. And a lot of work done in social emotions: embarrassment, awe, jealousy, pride. And there's kinds of emotions called homeostatic emotions, like pain or hunger, that people used to call drives. And so all these different states of your mind are emotions today. And we also know that they're not, I would say, unitary is a term that you can use, which I'll explain, which means I said fear is indivisible. There's fear. There's not this kind of fear and that kind of fear. Well, we now know that all these emotions are really just categories, approximations, and that there are different kinds of fear. And for each of those emotions, there are many different types, many different subtypes that are not, that can be quite different. For example, in fear, the fear that you experience, and we know this through brain imaging studies, the fear that you experience when, say, a scorpion is crawling up your arm is different in your brain than a fear of suffocation. And there was a very interesting experiment on someone who had bilateral amygdala damage, or I think maybe even congenital, and she could not feel any fear, let's say, of the scorpion, but she did feel fear of suffocation.
Oh my gosh! Wow.
Yeah, and I have to give her credit for doing the experiment.
Yeah.
To do that, it's almost like waterboarding. They put her in a situation with it's either decreased oxygen or increased CO2. I don't remember, but she felt like she was suffocating, and they observed that. So each emotion is really a category of emotions, and they're also not that separated. For instance, fear and anxiety are often difficult to tell apart. Anxiety in general is something that is potential and theoretical in the future, and maybe not really that specific or definite, whereas fear is something that's here and now and definite right in front of you. But there are cases where that's a little bit blurred because you're not sure if something's there, for example.
Is it important to distinguish our emotions? Like,
well, that's a good point. I mean, is it? Well, when I'm talking to you as my friend, I want to say I was afraid. So I have to have, it's important in talking about to have some category names, but it's also important to realize their limits. And for researchers, it's very important because you have to get precise. So when you're doing an experiment on fear, you have to know that there's different kinds of fear. Otherwise, you can get confounded results. So this is all stuff that's being sorted out now.
Wow. And the studies that you talk about in the book, I'd love to have you tell some more of the stories from the book about how you kind of the kind of meta questions of how these different emotions show up in our lives, because you have some really fascinating examples of that. And even the studies that scientists come up with to try and explore and measure this are super fascinating. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of those stories and things that you came across in researching? And
well, the book was amazing. So in all my books, I see that my role or my niche is to explain complex science, and I try to make it science that's relevant for you in your life that I treat, and to explain it using stories, maybe a little humor. And, I used to write for television. I wrote for about 8 or 9 years. I wrote for Star Trek, The Next Generation, and MacGyver. And I wrote for some comedies. I wrote for
I can't believe I didn't know that.
If you remember Night Court. And
they definitely need to add that to your bio. Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
Oh yeah, maybe I should. Yeah. But I feel like I've written short stories since I was a kid. So I feel I have a sense for stories, and I try to tell stories in the book, but of course the stories have to be relevant and illustrate something. So that's my challenge, is to find interesting, humorous, bizarre, or dramatic stories to illustrate the points I want to make, to make the book livelier and more, easier to read and to remember. And this book was amazing for that, because the topic is emotion. So there are so many stories of emotions gone awry, and of researchers, I have to say, also gone awry. Like, I'll just throw out, I won't get into it, but the head transplant people.
Yeah.
Interesting one. The guy who was putting electrodes into people's brains and trying to give them an orgasm that way, and killed many people doing that. I mean, there's this crazy, back in the old days, this is not those particular stories. Well, actually, the head transplant is ongoing today in China.
Wow. But, I just saw a notification about that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, but there's also a lot of stories of just individuals who had, emotions gone awry. I had many discussions with my editor, because he'd say, Leonard, it's the point of your book is that emotions are useful for us, that we can't live without them, and we're all, and they're not counterproductive. How come you're telling all these stories of emotions going awry? I go, well,
100%.
Because they're much more. Well, I'm illustrating what the emotion does by a case where it goes overboard, and it's like illustrating vision through optical illusions or mirages. And we know that we have optical illusions, mirages. Some of them are really cool. I don't know if your people in the audience ever go online, but there's some pretty cool illusions you can get online. But the fact that you have interesting optical illusions doesn't mean that you don't want to see. And the fact that emotions can get out of hand, maybe they're too exaggerated about something, you've overreacted, or maybe they persisted past the time when that situation is, and so that's gone wrong. Those things can happen. I have a chapter in the book about how to prevent or regulate, how to regulate your emotion. But that can happen, especially since our emotions evolved in a time when we were living in the wild, and we have a much different society today.
Yeah. I find that super fascinating, the kind of evolutionary part of it, and how they, thinking about how emotions served us in our, back in the, I'm not sure, can we say primitive, like in our primitive state of kind of coming into ourselves, like fear or love or protectiveness?
Well, so I have the story about the guy who his girlfriend broke up with him, and so he hires a friend to shoot him, so he gets sympathy from her. Now, in what world does that seem logically correct? But it's in the state of mind of in this case, overblown state of mind of love. But when you're in a love state, things change. Your goals change. You value the welfare of the person you're in love with greater than your own less. You tend to be more connected to society in general. A lot of aspects of your logical reasoning change, and in that case, it went overboard, and it didn't go too well.
Not too good for that one. Yeah, that's an entertaining and yet pretty upset, kind of a little upsetting story. There's some good ones in there, and yeah. Can you talk about also like how to regulate and manage our emotions, which is a section in the book about how to kind of do that and the optimal balance of emotions in our lives? For example, like meditation or like calming down, breathing can kind of help you to kind of take a moment. You have talk about anger in the book, and one reaction could be to just go for it, or suggestion to kind of like take a breath. So yeah, what about like emotional regulation and kind of channeling them or using them optimally in our lives?
So one method of emotion regulation that's very popular, especially among men, is suppression. And that's don't feel, don't think about it, pretend it's not there, do whatever it takes to insulate yourself. And that is a very destructive. It doesn't really work. It doesn't achieve the goal that you're going after. And also it's just bad for your body. You end up with increased cortisol levels. People who chronically suppress emotions have considerably more heart attacks and a lower shorter lifespan. So it's good to get rid of that.
Leonard, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Does everyone have emotions? Like, do all humans have emotions?
So all humans are meant to have emotions. There are disorders. It doesn't mean negative, no negative intent, it's connotation to that, but there are situations where the body is not working as intended, and there are people who either don't. There are people who with certain illnesses that have parts of their brain affected that have emotion deficits. There are people who congenitally do not experience, especially social emotions, for example. Don't have empathy. Some of them are fine. Some of them are leaders in the community. Some of them are serial killers, mass murderers. Because if you don't have empathy and you don't feel, for another human being, you don't have social, you don't feel guilt or shame or sympathy, then you treat people differently. I talk about in the book about the guy who was in Las Vegas and killed so many people from a hotel room. And to him, it was like a video game. But if you don't feel anything for other human beings, that can happen. So then there are people, alexithymia. It's a condition where it's not exactly true that they don't have emotion, but they're not in touch with their emotions, or not aware, or don't understand what emotion they're feeling. So there's all sorts of things that happen. And by studying all that, that's one way that people learn about emotion. There's interesting stories about how certain parts of your brain are affected, and then you have no motivation, you have complete apathy, you just sit there and never do anything.
Wow.
And so I have a couple of chapters on emotion and motivation and determination, because that's very important. If we didn't have emotion, you would just sit there like a computer. Of course, my computer has no legs to move, but even if it did, it wouldn't move because it needs someone to tell it to move. But you don't need that. You can initiate yourself because of your feelings. You decide, I'm hungry. I want to get up, get something to eat. I'm tired of sitting here. I want to walk around the block or whatever. I feel like going outside and seeing the sun. This is all emotion based. If you didn't have emotions, you would sit there and do nothing. Amazing.
Thank you so much. I feel like there's still that remnant of emotions are detrimental, and it's so healing to kind of hear like our feelings are a massive part of our lives, and it's a positive thing, the motivation, the drive, the empathy, all of that stuff. So really so interesting.
Every minute of the day, I mean, you don't feel necessarily emotions constantly, but you feel it much more often than you realize. It's not just when that person cuts you off in traffic, that you get angry and you have an emotion. People watching us now, they could be amused, they could be bored, and they will behave appropriately. They may get up they may turn us off, or these are feelings you're having all along, every minute, that govern what you're doing, other than just sitting still.
Yeah. Wow. Amazing. We have some really great questions coming in on the Q&A. I want to thank our audience for being here and for asking those questions, which we will get to in just a moment. A reminder, the Q&A tab is at the bottom of your screen, so you can just pop in there if you want. There's some good questions coming in. So I think we covered like a tiny fraction of the questions that I had for you, but it's just delightful. And I've been loving the book. So anything else you want to add before we turn to the audience questions?
I'll talk a little bit. I think it's important to talk about the psychological profile. So you asked, people don't feel emotions, but we all have the same emotion machinery compared, as humans, compared to, say, other primates or other animals. We now believe that, or understand that most animals have emotion. It was felt for a while that only mammals had emotion. There's research done on fruit fly emotion now, and it's kind of interesting. You'll learn that when a fruit fly gets sexually rejected, a male fruit fly, and then you offer it a drink, it goes for the drink.
Wow.
Much more than a control group. So we have that commonality, but with other animals, but amongst humans, we have individual differences as well, and our individual differences are not nearly as great as our differences with other species, but they're there, and each person, partly due to your own nature, your own genetics, partly due to your upbringing, you have different emotion tendencies. You may have a propensity to feel some emotion more easily than others. That you may have some emotions that linger longer once they're triggered in you than others.
Right.
So there's different aspects of your relation to emotion, and since scientists, in order to study emotion, they have to be able to measure it. It isn't necessarily a number, but it's good if it's numerical. But you have to at least be able to measure. If you're putting people on a disgust state, let's say, how do you know if they're in a disgust state?
Yeah, totally.
You assume they are, because to you that stuff's disgusting.
Right.
They're not disgusted. So they've developed these inventories, which they call them inventories, or questionnaires. So for the purposes of research, there's on a lot of different emotions, there are questionnaires that scientists have done many studies on, really studied hundreds or thousands of people in order to develop a set of questions that will determine your propensity toward one emotion or another, or whether you're in that state. And those are really interesting, because you learn about yourself by taking those, but you also learn about what they mean by the emotion, because as you read those questions, you can see what they're getting at. So you learn what the psychology researchers mean by that. And I have some for like shame and guilt, aggression, fear, love, happiness, and so forth.
Yeah.
And
that's in the book, right? You have those questions.
Those are in the book. Yeah. And those are, And so if you do that and you learn about yourself, I think it gives you a better connection to the science, because, we all care about ourselves. And so if there's a connection there, I think that's good.
Definitely. Yeah, totally. Thank you so much. Okay, well, let's dive into some of these audience questions. I'm just going to go from the top, and we will get into it. Someone asked, do you think the movie Inside Out is a good representation of human emotions in the brain? For folks that don't remember, that was a Disney animated, a little girl, Riley, moves across the country and has an experience, and you kind of see from inside her brain, like, what's going on.
I didn't remember until you just said that, and now I do. So thank you.
So it might not be top of your mind as far as like, did you watch the movie, or are you familiar with it?
I am very familiar with it, and I'll tell you why. My good friend Ralph Adolphs, who wrote this textbook,
awesome.
This is a neuroscience textbook. He uses that as an example of how emotions, how don't work, or a good illustration of how not to think about emotion.
Wow.
So I'm glad you
Sorry,
said
Disney.
So that again, that was the Darwinian or the classic traditional theory of emotion. There are, there are some distinct emotions. There are a limited number. They're very well defined. They interfere and cause mischief and so forth. You should try to, work around them and so forth. So that is not how
that's pure fiction, is what you're saying.
Yes, it's pure fiction,
Wow.
and but it's not based in it's not, they didn't make that up. That's a myth that exists out there, and they're following the myth.
In terms of like, these are the emotions, these are the characters, this is your brain structure, and here's what's going on.
Well, that each one is a character, right? Well, we don't. Yeah. There is no like the amygdala and fear. They thought for a while, but this was in the 90s, that this is where fear is. Well, now we know that not all fear goes through the amygdala. And we know that the amygdala is involved in many other emotions other than fear.
Wow.
So there's no like fear and amygdala. And we even know that the amygdala is not a whole structure or a singular structure in itself. The amygdala is made of, I forgot the latest, 12 or 20 substructures that are really quite different within it. So that whole idea is just not workable. And that the whole book is about how that's not true.
Oh, so interesting. What was the name of the book again? If you have it, you can hold it up.
No, I mean my book. His book.
Oh, yeah. Okay, great.
Yeah. His book is called The Neuroscience of Emotion. But then if you want a good textbook, I recommend it. But it's not. I would hope as reasonable as my book.
This one's much easier to read. Like, it's very digestible, really a page turner. So
mine's, I wrote a popular book. He wrote a book for neuroscience graduate students.
We'll stay in our lane. You know what I mean? Okay, let's go.
But I recommend it if you are a neuroscience graduate student. You want to read something that they're reading. It's
awesome. Cool. If I had 6 hands, I would go pop a link in the chat.
I should also say that it's also David Anderson was his co-author. I always leave poor David out, but
Cool. Awesome. Anonymous attendee says, my boyfriend says I use my emotions too much when making decisions. Is there ever a time when gut feelings can override empiricism?
Okay. So first of all, tell your boyfriend that he's wrong. and it's not, you don't use your emotions. Give him the book.
Yeah, exactly. Buy 2 copies, Anonymous. Yes.
As I described earlier, your emotions work and you have no control over it. They're gonna do it. These kids who had the disgust and the pens, they don't decide. They don't go, I'm disgusted, therefore I don't want I'm going to ask for less money. They're not even aware it's happening. It just happens. It automatically happens. Just so your emotional state automatically affects your brain. Your boyfriend is telling you he believes your emotions are too vivid or too strong. And I don't, that the question is, do you feel that emotions are getting in the way, and that you can use the regulation if you feel that that's the case. But the idea that you decide and you're going to use your emotion to make a decision, that's not how it works. Your emotion goes into that. Now, in terms of gut feeling, so another thing we didn't talk about was something called core affect. And core affect is a kind of proto emotion, or a kind of feeling that you have that is not differentiated. It's like an emotion, but it's not specific, like disgust or fear. It only has 2 dimensions. It's either positive or negative, and it's either strong or weak. So it can be weak, positive, strong, and it's really the answer to how you're feeling right now. One answer is you could tell whatever is bothering you or whatever you're looking forward to. But a top line answer is, I feel pretty good, or I feel terrible. That's your core affect. Your core affect is a feeling that's always there, but you're not always conscious of it. So unlike an emotion, it's always there. And its purpose is to read your body and to prepare your brain for what's going on with your body. Are you too hot, too cold? Are you hungry? Are you thirsty? Are you tired? What's going on with your body? Are you in your environment? Is it threatening? Are you about to get eaten, killed? So some very basic input from your senses and from your body feeds into that feeling. And it's on this level of unconscious emotion that gut feelings come from. So scientists have found that when a decision is very difficult, when a decision has a lot of data and is very complex, your unconscious mind does a better job making that decision and processing that data than your conscious mind, which is so limited.
Wow.
And on that unconscious level, emotion plays a very important role. So whenever you have a gut feeling or an intuition, that is coming from your emotions, or a large part of that is coming from your emotions.
Right.
But again, you don't have a choice. Just like when you have a gut feeling, you don't build the gut feeling. You don't decide to have that gut feeling. It's just there. That's a characteristic of unconscious processing. So so that's kind of how it works.
Okay, cool. And can emotions be measured? Like they're measured by brain activity, basically? Is that how you like identify?
No, they're measured by these behavioral tests, like the inventory.
Oh, behavioral. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not like,
we can well, we do look at brain through imaging and study what the processes are that are related to or correlated with emotions, but it's not nearly like, oh, I'm looking at I can see extreme fear versus middle fear or little fear, or it's not that developed.
Wow. So scientists measure emotions through the behavior that comes out from
they ask people questions like on these questionnaires, or sometimes they just simply ask people, or they give them a simple scale of 1 to 5. Are you how fearful are you? If they want to induce a fear state, well, let's say that's a little bit a harder one, but so they want to induce a sadness state, they'll show them a clip from a couple clips maybe from a really sad movies, and then they'll just check in with them. They'll say, on a 1 to 10, how sad do you feel? Okay, let's do the experiment now.
Right. Yeah. Like yeah. And it's one last point here with this question about the gut feeling is it reminds me to bring up that emotions can be felt so much throughout the body, like a tightness in the chest.
It goes both ways. So your emotions, it's important to realize, and Darwin knew this, that your emotions cause bodily changes, right?
Right.
And bodily changes cause you to perceive an emotion. It goes both ways. And people have argued since Darwin and William James in the late 19th century and all the way through the 20th century, what comes first, the bodily reaction or the emotion? And it's very complicated. They kind of come at the same time and affect each other. And
and in terms of how you can control it, sometimes by breathing, you can slow it down, or, it brings up.
There's a famous study where they had people smile. They didn't tell them they were having them smile because that would have biased them, but they had them do something, which I don't remember.
Experiments are hilarious.
No, something like hold a pen a certain way. That in order to do it, you have to smile.
Oh my gosh.
And then they tested them and found that that just smiling put them in a happier state. So now, you might think that being in a happy state makes me smile, but smiling also puts you in a happy state. So it goes both ways.
So interesting. Well, that leads us to a good question here from Heather Griffith, who asks, are there emotions that are harmful to the body, or do reactions like suppression of emotion and the responses cause the negative physiological responses?
Well, definitely the latter.
Mm-hmm.
And there are no emotions that are inherently damaging to the body. They all came for a purpose. Now, if you're always in a state of fear, but you're not in a dangerous situation, that's harmful, because your body gets ready for if you're in a state of fear, it gets ready for fight or flight, or it gets your adrenaline gets going. Your things happen in your body which are not good to have long term when they're not needed. But if the emotion is occurring appropriately in the situation, then it's good. And it's when you have someone who has a chronic tendency toward an emotion without the triggers, or without the any reason for it, like chronic anxiety, for example, that has does long-term damage, like getting the cortisol, the stress hormones are not good to have around. And in fact, this is a little bit of an aside, but with anxiety, people with chronic high anxiety have a lower lifespan, but so do people with chronic low anxiety.
Wow.
And, that's because anxiety has a purpose. If you're in the middle, if you're in the sweet spot, anxiety is playing its role. I have a certain amount of anxiety. So if I see a mole, I get it checked out.
Right.
If I have too much anxiety, I guess I'm going all the time and the doctor doesn't even look anymore. I go, yeah, you're fine. But if I don't have enough anxiety, then I don't go.
Oh, that's really interesting.
And I die of cancer. So
Right.
Anxiety, like all emotions have their purpose, and it's when you tend to experience them inappropriately in the wrong situation, or they linger too much, or you have an exaggerated experience that it causes problems.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. We have a couple questions here about emotions related to the pandemic, which maybe we can discuss. Someone says, Mr. Mlodinow, what role do you think emotions are playing in the pandemic at this time? And what are some strategies you recommend in regulating more disruptive emotions in our day-to-day, like boredom, loneliness, wallowing, which seems to increase likelihood for riskier social behaviors?
So, I mean, what role does it does it play in the pandemic? Yeah.
I mean, we see the anger, we see the, anyway, yeah.
Well, it's hard to separate that from the politics of the pandemic. So
another person brought that up. So yes, exactly.
I would say in the pandemic itself, it does stimulate certain, especially early on before the vaccines, anxiety, fear, chronic levels, probably, since the danger actually was there or imminent for a long time. Boredom is, when you're, the lack of social interaction is a problem, because we're all social creatures, and it can cause depression and other stress and other issues. The politics of it is another thing that we probably shouldn't get into, but there's a lot there.
I mean, I guess what I'm seeing here from these two questions, another one I'll just add in here about, given that we're living in a high anxiety time due to political climate being so polarized, climate change, and yes, the lockdown, pandemic lifestyle, what's your advice? So I think people are kind of, what's your advice, I guess?
Well, I mean, first of all, you have to keep social connection. So I had a lot of Zoom cocktail parties and so forth. It's really very important, and not totally superficial where you're just looking at people's Twitter feeds, but where you maybe see somebody and interact with them, and
that can really fill the tank so much if you have those connections and those gatherings outside or whatever.
Right, and you have to, I think it's good to fight the boredom by finding things to do. I wrote a novel during the COVID
oh my gosh
quarantine. So yeah,
wow.
I think purpose is important in life and in keeping you healthy, and that's connected with motivation and determination, and very much rooted in emotion. But I think that you have to make sure you still have a purpose and something that you look forward to in the day, or accomplishing, or whatever it is. So it's really not retreating into a shell or a cocoon, even though you may be, maybe hard to get out, or you can't go to the places you're used to going to. You have to find substitutes, and technology can help that. I mean, technology has caused a lot of bad things in our emotional lives. We didn't really talk about that, but we were built to live in groups of 20, 30, 40, 50 individuals wandering the savannah, and we would probably interact closely with just a handful of people in a given day. And now through, kind of obviously through television, but that's a very weak interaction, but much more strongly interactive through social media with dozens, hundreds of people every day.
Yeah.
And that can cause issues, because we're not really designed to do that. So for example, we just talked about fear, and another thing we didn't talk about is emotion contagion. That's in the book too. But
that's so fascinating.
There's a reason for that, and it served a constructive purpose. But when emotion contagions goes wild on social media, where people are spreading hate or anger or fear, and that reaches other people and causes them to experience that.
So powerful.
Those are bad things.
Gotcha. Okay. We are nearing the end of our time together here tonight, but we have a couple more questions here. Karen asks, how do emotions affect thought? And I think we talked a little bit about this.
I think we talked a lot about that.
Yeah, I think so too. So it basically affects it a lot. Like that's what I would say.
Just rewind. Maybe she missed the beginning.
Yeah, exactly. The replay will definitely be available. And we went into that in great depth. Based on, this is a fun one. Based on what you learned while writing emotional, how would you write characters like Data or Vulcans now?
I love that. Well, Spock was had an out because he was half human, so you could tap into whichever side you wanted whenever you needed it, right? Data was a problem. Had I known then what I know now, I would have not that's the wrong word, but I would have pissed off my colleagues at Star Trek because I would be constantly telling them, no, don't you see, Data will just stand there and do nothing until he's ordered to do something. Because where's his motive? He has no feeling. He has no motivation. Why is he even moving? Maybe Picard said, "Oh, Data, go check out the engine and see if it's the antimatter is kissing the algae or whatever the hell, I don't remember anymore." And he would go down and check that out, and then he would come back and just sit there. So that would have been a problem because a lot of I remember an episode where Data was insisting that he was a sentient being. It was if I remember right, was feeling bad about not being considered a sentient being. We had a whole trial to see, why would a computer care without you don't have emotion? You don't care.
Exactly.
So I didn't think about it too deeply back then, but I'll tell you a story. When I first got out, they didn't hire me because I was a physicist. They didn't even know when they hired me. But I got on there and I'm on my first day and we're brainstorming stories for the season. And I was so excited because I'm going to bring real science to Star Trek. And I had this idea, and it had to do with neutrinos and yada. And I sit around the table. There were like the producers and the writers, maybe 8 people, so I get like a 30 seconds or a minute to kind of tell my story, and I'm all excited. I tell the story, and then I look around, and everyone's kind of like, just. And I look at my boss sitting next to me, and I'm thinking, well, I don't know what didn't seem to go over that well. Just turns to me and says, "Shut up, you effing egghead." He didn't say effing though. He used the real word. I don't know if you can do that on your. No, I didn't say it. And then I never brought stuff like that up again. I realized that they were not really that interested. They had a science advisor, but he was a geologist. He didn't know anything about the astrophysics and stuff that that was going on there. And they didn't really look at his comments either. But they wanted to have a science advisor so they wanted people to know that they had a science advisor. But
right.
They really, I mean, I should say that sounds so negative, but I mean, what they cared about was compelling stories and characters, and the stories often had real depth and intellectual. Yeah. I loved it because it had some intellectual, like the thing about Data is, can a robot be a sentient being? Is a very interesting question. It's just that Data would never have asked that question.
Yeah, right.
But, you could say that I believe that in the future, because we're now, I should say that computer science is being revolutionized too right now. You may have heard of neural networks and deep learning and so forth. And so the old way of programming a computer was to give it a set of rules. They're basically if then statements. If this, then do that. If that, do that. And you put together millions of them and somehow you get processing, right? They're all switches that are on or off. If this one is on and that one's off, then turn this one on or off. And it's like that on that machine level, right?
Right.
Our brains are different. We have neurons that take input from thousands of other neurons and they build to a threshold, and the input either raises or lowers the amount of input that they have. And when they reach a threshold, they fire and they send their signal to the ones they're connected to, and they go outgoing. And that's really what neural networks and the new kind of programming is modeling. We have 100 billion neurons connected to thousands each. So that's a long way till they can get anything like what we do. Wow. But that kind of processing, when they do that kind of processing, what they're doing is they're putting the computer in a situation where it learns what to do. So they're not saying, in order to solve this equation, like when I was a graduate student, couldn't solve an equation. I would get algorithms to solve the equation. I would tell the computer, do this, do this, do that, and it would crank through those steps and give me an answer. I knew how it worked. I designed it, and I got an answer. Well, nowadays you don't. You design a computer that's capable of learning how to solve that. Then you put it in a situation which is complicated, but you put it in a situation whereby it tries to solve it millions of times, and sometimes it's successful and somehow evolves toward knowing how to do it. And when you're done, you have no idea what its programming is. It's just learned, and it's so much more powerful than doing it the other way.
Wow.
And I believe that, 50, 100, 1,000, whatever years from now, when we get extremely much more complex and larger programs that can do that they will, in that process of solving the problems, they will evolve their own emotions for that situation, what we could call an emotion.
Wow.
Without us actually writing it in there. But I think that emotions are a property of a highly developed, evolved neural network system.
Wow.
So
that's super interesting. And that actually, you answered the final question that we have here about how do you feel about Roger Penrose's concept of the brain not being a computer, but a more complex and emotional organ, which you really, it's in, read the book, because it's really in there about, how to, that whole concept, and the revolution of that. Incredible. Wow. So interesting. Thank you so much. I feel like I've learned so much. It's such a fascinating and broad and kind of hard to pin down at moments. But it's really so great to kind of take it in and realize how much feelings and emotions are present in our lives. And to maybe, do you think would you say it's valuable to kind of tune into your emotions and to kind of to start paying attention to them? Like,
I would say, if I didn't think that, I wouldn't have written the book.
Yeah. The subtitle, How Feelings Shape Our Thinking, and then thinking kind of is what helps us to be in the world and to live our lives. And so, it's such a critical component. Amazing. Well, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure to speak with you tonight and for you to share your book. Congratulations. Folks, I really recommend this title. There's links in the chat for this book, as well as his backlist, some of which you can see here. I'm excited about your novel. I can't wait to add you to our fiction section as well. When I was gathering for display, I was gathering your books, and it was like, they were all over the store. It was like math, physics, business, self-help. It was like amazing, just your interest. And it's just such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's a fun conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming, and have a great night. Bye.
Bye-bye.